Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back for the second part of the space series that would lead to the predictive thread within, I think, about 3 to 4 weeks. I would like to have the predictive thread at the beginning of the year 2026. But even if given the current developments, especially the tactical ones, which will be the core subject of this space, it seems that we can do the predictive thread a week or two before the new year 2026. First of all, I would like to point out a couple of things that were obvious to people who might or might have not remembered what I said, is that um, the problem for the Ukrainian army is not that as much as the Russians are succeeding in their pushes, but that the Russians are making pushes far deeper each and every time, because it means that a gap has been created, a void has been created when the Russians can start pushing. A simple example: Deep State said we stabilized Liman, we are blocking Yampol, and the road Seversk to Liman is blocked. The very next day, of course, the images are not from the very next day. It's just that they were shown at that moment. Show that the Russians are even deeper in Liman. Okay, they got killed, captured, whatever. In a certain sense, it doesn't really matter, because it shows that all the pretense of stabilization, of control, is futile on the Ukrainian side. And on that, we already had a discussion with the previous space. And it's a huge part of the discussion. So basically, the attrition is playing a dominant role into the gaps of the Ukrainian defenses. But as you might have seen more recently, the Russians are pushing. The latest from Cop State, for instance, is seeing the Russians being in Novodanilovka and completely clearing up the Robotine area, being able to freely move there, although they get attacked on the way back by FPV drone. It means that there are no Ukrainians on the area. That part there is not even no man's land anymore. It's just right for the taking from the Russians to push up forward. Why am I saying a tactical switch for victory? Because the victory in this war is going to be tactical. The strategic victory is not going to be on the field. I already explained that on the first space. The strategic advantages that Russia is betting upon are honestly very little in the battlefield. The results of the strategic advantages are seen on the battlefield, namely chiefly by the attrition process. But the advances that Russia is going to make are going to be tactical, and those tactical advances, those mission-based advances, are already leading to a clear vision of chaos, if not localized crumbling. And where chaos reigns, the defenses, who need a huge organization, synchronization, and communication, they falter. The Russians felt this firsthand in 2022 around Kharkov. Chaos gripped the defensive lines past Izium, and probably some of the worst episodes of miscommunication, of completely breakdown of C2, C4, counter orders coming too early or too late, a pessimistic and alarmist information flow, denying the Russians the calmness and the coolness to actually analyze the situation. That led to some local commanders got out to fight an enemy that had already passed their positions and literally got cut while pulling back and lapping, engaging the reserves while they were walking straight into an ambush. So generally speaking, as I said, it is tactically that Russia has been making its biggest progress, both operatively but also on the ground. A lot of people are going to laugh when I'm going to say it, but for instance, the readaptation of the Russian military into a lighter motorized force, or even donkeys actually, pure green army, has led to the Ukrainians not being able to cope with the process of atomization of the firepower and atomization of the fighting units. What does atomization of the fighting units mean? Is it something that everybody's explaining by a fire team, a platoon, or a company split into binomes or trinomes, or up to 8 people being sent? 8 people was the typical Wagner subunit being sent in the area. Then those 8 split again in binomes, try to have angles covered, and then another 8 comes and they advance and advance and advance. So that situation, because of the spread and the trickle-down effect, which means that on one side, a smaller group can spread over a bigger area because you play on the initiative. You are the one who attacks. You choose the position. Of course, you're going to get killed or wounded if you fuck up, which is more than a 50-50 chance. But because of your spreading the whole defense, if the things go right, you're going to end up with a 360 threat for the defenders. Back in 2023 and even 2024, the defenders could have a modicum of defensive line. In 2025, that has completely disappeared, mostly because of the attrition, but also other issues. And then now, the defenders are on subplots. So basically 2, 3, 4, 5 people on a limited trench, mostly nearby some vegetation to allow them to have cover from the drones. And at the same time, that cover from the drones also doesn't help with the visibility around the position to defend. And very recently, we've seen something that happened late in Kursk, which is a position being overrun, the Ukrainians getting grabbed out, laid down to the ground, and ventilated with a wonderful watermelon moment on one of them. But that's something else. But what I mean by this is that the logic of putting these isolated outposts, something that the Russians were doing with tripwire forces, especially with ZEX, but here the Ukrainians are not planning any kind of tripwire. What they're doing is literally hoping that these holes are going to keep the Russians occupied long enough in order to be cleared by a massive amount of troops, so that the Russians would get slowed down, and then FPVs, drones, Babagas, whatever would come. The Russians tactically innovated by, instead of trying to clear these positions out, they are going in the back and trying to get rid of the reserves that are supposed to back these positions. On top of it, the smaller positions are easier to target by FPV drones or even bombers. And of course, with the optifiber, so another tactical evolution on the Russian side, you can now go after these dugouts without fearing electronic warfare, but also having a crisp, clear picture quality that would allow you to look at the face of the pigger when you blow his ass up. And therefore, this makes it easier for the Russians to actually clear out these smaller positions and allow the gap to widen once the DRGs on BMPs to have a small joke about it. But once the infiltration works and the rear reserves is starting to get called, the guys who are up front, as usual, are going to have only two choices, which is get the fuck out of the position and run back to their main line, or stay on the position, and in any case, you're going to become a casualty. For a lot of persons, you become a casualty during the assault, but for others, as I said, you become a casualty because, well, you resisted. And on top of it, often there is animosity between the two sides. And of course, this is an euphemism, but there's animosity because sometimes some assaults on the Russian side have failed, and mostly because they couldn't clear the gas fast enough, FPVs coming in or other drones coming in, and of course the Russians will incur casualties. And those casualties are the main propelling force behind executions. There are people who like killing. There are people who are absolute trash, in a certain sense. But in this case, it's not that. In this case, it's the past experience with UCROPs, especially drone operators. And this is one thing that I'm going to make my first digression. Drone operators in this battlefield, on the Ukrainian side, if they get caught by the Russians, still breathing, even if they're going to die, they're going to get ventilated. It's not a matter of discussion. Drone operators, especially on the Ukrainian side, for a long while have sold this absolute atrocious attitude and dehumanization attitude towards the Russians. Magyar continues to show bullshit, so the return, the backlash out of that, which is, oh, you like flying drones, let me fly you to the moon. Piling up to the ground, and you empty whatever magazine you have. If possible, like another footage we saw, his own rifle. So, at least you don't spend your federal taxpayers' money on a new crop. So the problem with this tactical change, in a certain sense, that the Russian military has undergone, which is a massive reliance on drones, especially optifiber drones, and a massive reliance on small unit tactics, motorized ones, sometimes looking like they are improvised. And improvisation is a form of art, guys, when it comes to war. The Russians are showing something that, we knew, Zegers knew that things were going to change because people are not stupid. Such a great nation with so many people is not going to be stupid long enough. And one of the things I always point out, if a bunch of autists on Twitter can figure out some things, trust me, those guys are going to be on steroids compared to us. So most of the problems the Russians are going to have right now is the counter value they're going to face. So basically, one of the things that the Russians for the moment cannot touch is the supplies to the Ukrainian side, money, foodstuff, other types of supplies, and of course weaponry. And the second part is, of course, the ISR deal, which unfortunately, even with some modicum of Chinese help, you just cannot avoid. And there is one sector where this ISR slash comms help, aid, whatever, is really painfully observable. And that's the attacks on Crimea, which rely fully on Starlink dishes installed on Rubakas and send them to fly and destroy Russian equipment within Crimea because the jamming doesn't work, Starlink, SATCOM, and of course the type of penetrating maneuvers that the Ukrainians are employing with these assets are daring and right now well oiled. So those two aspects, the ISR deal, but also the fact that there is no blockade of Ukraine, is something that Russians had to tactically overcome. And they have overcome this by multiple aspects. First of all, is by simply mimicking the Ukrainians. The mimicry of the Ukrainians is to find a way to have the same kind of ISR. And that's what they did initially with the Starlink connection, where Americans and everybody else was crying about how the Russians could have access to Starlink. Unfortunately, as I said, and this I've said it from the beginning, Starlink is spoofed in-house for the Ukrainians. So Elon Musk can say whatever he fucking wants. His company is modifying or helping Ukrainians to modify and spoof the geofencing. So a lot of the dishes that technically should not be crossing to Russia or to Crimea or whatever, they have no issue with that. And someone is helping the Ukrainians to completely, alter proprietary intellectual data, which means that for some reason, it's impossible for Galen to stop that situation with the alleged geofencing. Which means I'm telling you again that Starlink, despite the fact it's supposed to be a private company, is fed through and through. So from the beginning, I am having huge issues with the Russians relying on Starlink for that communication. But for some reason, there is no real backlash in a certain sense, although we don't really know. But as I said, technically, the Russians first of all started mimicking it, then they started having different solutions, notably with mesh networks, then by buying huge SIM cards, Ukrainian SIM cards, and then using those SIM cards to have a connection, and then cell towers in order to have a deep penetration of ISR assets, their own ISR assets, mostly localized, mostly of the lower echelon. Now the problem with the Russians bypassing initially the communication situation and then bypassing the continuous supply of the Ukrainian side, what happened once again with a strategic reach to partners, notably North Korea for some ammunition, and China, allegedly, again, for intelligence. But it seems that whatever help they had wasn't the kind of all-in intelligence data that, for instance, Ukrainians are getting from the US for strikes deep into Russia or even in the occupied areas for the Ukrainians. Now, the problem with, as I said, the fact that the Russians have accepted the proxy war and therefore cannot do much against Pindo in soft intervention, at least without a specific presence in Ukraine, but helping them with information, with some money yet, and so forth and so on. Russians have bypassed that by, unfortunately, as I said, imposing a very heavy toll on Ukrainians. So, okay, you're gonna have more weapons. You think you're gonna be ready? You want to go from welterweight to heavyweight? No issue. We're gonna apply heavyweight pressure on you, and this pressure tactically is seen as, I described this on the 3rd of September from an account that unfortunately got suspended. The pressure is to force Ukrainians to single stack their supply roads to different areas of the front. If you cannot have a carousel, a roundabout, a distribution cornerstone, like for instance was Pokrovsk, like Dobropila still is a little. Now you have Pavlograd, and then before that was Pokrovsk. So if you don't have these areas where you are going to actually start directing your supply lines up and down, left and right, but you have to go on one single stack of road that goes directly to the position where you need to offload, then let the distribution happen, then, as I said, you are going to split your effort. Logistically, you are going to split your effort. You will have to have 4 different trucks that would have to go through 4 different roads. If you have a nexus when you can start distributing left and right, you can have 2 trucks doing a split delivery because it's more or less the same road. You just at the end, you're going to have a last mile delivery, last 10 miles, whatever. But here, with the current situation, you have 4 different areas that are way too big in distance in between. That forces Ukraine to actually lower the efficacy of their transportation simply because, as I said, those are single stack roads. You cannot, within a acceptable time frame, start doing a distribution with the same truck, for instance, or the same unit. You need to open up, you need more units, and that, in order to palliate to that, the Ukrainians went to pickups. But this is since the beginning of the war. And of course, as I said, the pickups, they are very good compared to UGVs, but they are very bad when compared to actual trucks. And it is this tactical decay that Russia inflicted upon Ukraine that then start to adapt itself simply because why the fuck would you need 3 Urals when you're sending 12 guys in 6 motorbikes to attack a position? And of course, you can feel where I'm going with the cynicism and the rather difficult to swallow argument that, some people have to die anyway in war. So just take this, as something that's coming. And of course, this gives the feeling that the Russians are compensating for the lack of answers for drones by piling up bodies. Well, tactically still a sound situation, given that Ukrainians did that in 2022. But on the Russian side, you see that there is a method to the madness. And of course, it is deeply interlinked with the situation on the Ukrainian side, where Ukrainians, as I said, on top of needing money, they need the people under the flag, but they also need to be able to articulate those people with the capacity to inflict damage and fight on the other side. And the Ukrainian side is just not able to cope with the pressure inflicted by the Russians. And once again, this has a lot to do with what we spoke previously, the fact that the logic behind the Ukrainian defensive system is not tactical in essence. For Ukrainians, and this is something I hear a lot from Ukrainian commentators, alleged specialists, but also idiots on Twitter, is that Ukraine has a strategy of slowing the Russians down to the point that any gains that they're going to make is irrelevant. However, this is a huge problem when you start speaking like this. Any gain would need to be taken back. That was the whole logic behind Kharkov. Is that, okay, we're going to lose it for the moment, but getting back to it. The problem is that the shrinking of the military of both sides, I'm speaking about the maneuver, the core element unit of maneuver, which when it comes to those core elements, the Ukrainians have a huge problem adapting, not that much to the agility and nimbleness of the Russian forces. They have a lot of problems to adapting to where the Russians want to go with this fucking attack. Ergo, there is a misunderstanding of the core tasks that the Russian infantry has, for instance. Everybody's going back to, oh yeah, you know, they accumulate into cellars and shit like that, and then they pop out and they take the place. Unfortunately, it's not how it works when you start thinking it properly. These people, when they get to the houses, they are starting to clear a path. And this was very visible in Siversk, but also very visible in Pokrovsk. Uh, I want to illustrate this by the bullshit that was spewed by the Ukrainians around the month of July when they said, oh, SBU entered the city and we cleared completely the situation and it was done. The problem with that is that you start seeing the things as they are and you understand that, okay, if you did the cleanup, if you tactically achieved your task, why the fuck you lost the south and you have infiltrations each and every day that not only become bigger, but they take you out of your territory that you were supposed to defend? And in Siversk, such thing happened when a rotation team had no clue the Russians were there and got executed. 2 or 3 were killed by gunfire, and 3 or 4 were killed by drone bomb. Now, the problem that you're gonna have when you try to bypass some logical steps in the defensive strategy, and this is, as I said, how the Ukrainians try to uh, give the drone a major role and let the humans just be a kind of barrier, a automated barrier that's going to fire bullets at your ass. The problem is, once again, that the Ukrainians just do not see where the Russians want to go with their actions. And this is also pattern to people who are actually pro-Ukrainian, be that Deep State, Gayfra, all these guys. Turkey, unfortunately, is the exception that confirms the rule. And these people actually are taking information, already a perfect information in the sense that it's already been ongoing and it's done. It's how things happen via Ukrainian sources, public or private. Whereas they should start looking at things on the map and say, okay, there is the problem. This is what opposes both strategically, ethically, but especially tactically, the Russians with the Ukrainians. Ukrainians were very good tactically all around 2022, and we learned that they were good because the US had put a lot of people behind the operational planning of the Ukrainian side. However, in the new way how the Russians are moving, the Ukrainians do not seem to understand the goal. And when the goal is there, it's too late. So, if you want one example, is the screen Dobropila. Once again, the Russians are not innovating tactically to the point when you say, my God, these guys are geniuses. As I said, that screen from the northern outskirts of Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, towards Dobropila was really straightforward. Of course, the methods that were used, infiltration, smaller groups, and then convergence into a position that they need to keep up for, I think, at least a month, show that the Russians are going to sacrifice smaller losses for a bigger goal. This is something that Ukrainians never managed to do. When Ukrainians, for instance, were busy at Davidov Brid, there was no feeling that that was the side quest, while the main quest was preparing to attack Kharkov. Actually, Kharkov felt like a way to shift the balance within the front. What happened, however, is that the screen worked so properly because now we have geolocations from the Ukrainians, and we see that the Russians went extremely far. So they did a mini Kursk action. And now, if you start looking at the DS maps, the movement is coming towards Sofiivka and Pankivka and Shakovo and Volodymyrivka. So that movement shows clearly that it's not because the Russians did not have the operational depth to keep the Dobropila salient open. The salient itself was a screen. And the fact that the Russians started letting it go and not trying to get it back, but attacked from the other side, so there would be a consolidation which would stop the Ukrainians from actually slicing through that northern buffer of Minograd and breaking the whole city out. That problem, once again, shows, as I told you, the difference between both sides. One side is objective driven, the other has no objective. Yesterday I told you that there is no plan to win anything. There is no plan to actually fight the war on the Ukrainian side. It's just, let's do this. Totally, bro, let's do it. Whereas the Russians understand that the strategic situation right now is close enough to just finish what was started by a lot of people. One of the things was the pressure on Siversk. For a lot of time, Belogorovka next to Siversk was a absolute shit show. Verkhovkamensk is just the same. And initially everybody laughed that, okay, Mordvichev arrived or whoever arrived, and suddenly you had a different approach. Yet we are 1 year after that, and Siversk is being invested only now. So it wasn't just a previous command situation. Although you can make the case that, okay, the previous command fucked so bad, so the new command is still busy recovering. I can accept that. So, tactically, the Ukrainians seem more and more unable to reply to the operational inventions on the Russian side. So we spoke about the scooters, we spoke about the motorbikes, we spoke about everything. But what we didn't speak about, and this is something that not a lot of people have understood when it comes to tactical level. Russian troops that go on raids, on infiltrations, on assaults, contrary to the Ukrainian ones, have well integrated and understood that there is going to be a more than 50-50 chance they don't come back. Therefore, a sheer level of fatalism that has taken over the Russian assault troops is now plausible for tactical innovation. And this is something that unfortunately carried over by Wagner. When Wagner were using Zex, for the Ukrainians, the problem is that they initially thought that these guys were like some kind of zombies or they were useless. And then suddenly started getting kicked their teeth in by the same Zeks who had managed to bypass the continuous line, and then it was a different story. The attrition has been transformed by the Russians as a tactical and deep scar upon the Ukrainian military. We are to the point that once the Russians get close enough from different maneuvers in different ways, the Ukrainians understand they seize and they just fucking roll over. A lot of people say, what the fuck are you saying? They are still defending Mirnograd, there are Johnson. Exactly. How did Pokrovsk go when they got infiltrated, according to Zelensky, by only 300 guys? We're speaking of a city between 60 and 85,000 inhabitants period of war. In size, in equipment, in urban setting. There is no 222 M3 dropping 9,000 kilogram bombs like in Azovstal over Pokrovsk. There are UMPKs, UMPBs, but the truth is that in Pokrovsk, you have the Russians already closing the lid on Pokrovsk itself, but also forcing Mirnograd to actually go to running the gauntlet. And on a recent video, we saw that something that Ukrainians love bragging about POWs and stuff like that, we saw on the road to Kolomishta about 15 to 20 Ukrainian prisoners from the area problem. So we can understand that the Russians are adapting. Their tactical advantage in that sense that goes with the strategic advantage is that, first of all, strategically they have the means to, and then tactically they have the brains to transform an advantage of having the means to create something that would help them bypass some of the problems within the system they're going to operate. And that's how you have the situations around Vovchansk, that's how you have the situations around Liman, that's how you have the situations down south in Zapo. The Russian C2, C4 is alive. The Ukrainian one isn't. One is preempting things, impressing its initiative into things. The other one is just waiting for things to happen. And yes, of course, people are going to say, yeah, but Russia is so big. I understand. Why wasn't it the case in 2022? Why wasn't it the case in 2023? Why wasn't it the case in Kursk in 2024? The answer is pretty simple on that aspect. And it's the core issue within this war and the way that the Ukrainians are waging it. So the problem with this, when it comes to the tactical aspect of the battlefield, is that the Ukrainian decisions on how to organize the defenses, so the tactical layout, are not a result of the necessity or how it works on the battlefield. They are a result to do the best possible with the shit they have at home. So you're actually not buying a system that already works. You're buying to a system that still needs to be trained, that has no real, how can I say this? No real vademecum on how to do things. And that's why everybody starts to be annoyed and yap about how Sirski micromanages everything. It seems to me that Sirski is forced to do that because the local command is shit. The same thing Adi Narod, also happened to the Russians. It sometimes still happens to them. So the problem, once again, is not as much that the Russians are geniuses, but it is halfway there. That they have good ideas, but Ukrainians are stupid. Or at least the Ukrainian leadership is not able to see the threats when they start developing. When they are already there, like the fucking situation in Kupiansk or the breaches in multiple areas up northeast around the Kharkov area. So, the advancement that is now linking up Dvorichna to up north. Well, you have a small problem there. And that problem is that you can squeeze Sirska as much as you want. The guy cannot change the fucking shitty hand he has. And one of the things that you can see right away why Sirski cannot do much, as I said, is that when Zele Bobik said that Kursk would be nice, and we had already an article saying 2023, the guy wants to attack Horlivka, and you're like, are you insane? And it's there where Zaluzhny broke up, I think, by saying, bro, you are nowhere near knowing anything about war. Just sit your ass tight and let us do our shit, That's how I think Zaluzhny, at some point, despite the fact that he was also completely retarded, but Zelensky is eons worse. And with Sirski, Zelensky has found both a loyal executioner, but also the perfect scapegoat. I mean, come on. He's among the few that has been educated in Moscow. He was deployed in Afghanistan. Okay, you're going to say, what fucking quality? Who the fuck cares? He was there. And then the problem that you see with this, the fact that, as I said, Sirski is at the same time a yes man, but also a potential scapegoat, is that whereas the Russians had the issue with politics stifling the military capacity, with Ukraine, politics were always behind the military capacity. They just, in a certain sense, presented to the world. The issue with that, though, is that the possibility for the Ukrainians to find someone to replace Sirski is very difficult. Because, as I said, in order to have this leadership, he has to get a large amount of middle management. So, majors, LT calls, and these guys are just not available at the quality and the quantity necessary for Ukraine. If you want an example, check the guy who became Rubicon's leader. Now compare that guy to Madiar. Mic drop. So the problem is, once again, it's not as much as the fact the Ukrainians just got stuck into their whole innovation tree. No, the Ukrainians are the reflection of what the army started to be from the beginning. Very few people that joined post February 2022 had the proper military experience, had the proper grasp of logistics, and also had the proper foundation when it came to warfare. What does this mean? This means that for the Ukrainian retards, I'm sorry to call them like this because it's an insult to retards, much of their fighting pool were people who had no fucking clue what they were doing. And for those that progressed through the ranks, be that on the abroad or here at home, um, the effort was just too small in order to produce someone who's going to be both competent doctrine-wise, but also who is going to start innovating outside of that doctrine. The reality is that Ukrainians just do not have it anymore. There is no doctrine whatsoever when it comes to defense or assault. Despite what everything says, their assaults right now haven't changed since 2022. They're gonna just fucking gun somewhere with an APC, AV, or a tank. They're gonna drone the shit out first, and if it doesn't work, and then the APC, IAV, whatever fails, there's not gonna be any correction. They're just gonna leave them there, just sucking dick. There's not gonna be a second wave or third wave. The rare times that you had the second, third wave, whatever, was when Ukraine was absolutely smashing the Russians. So roughly September to January, September 22, January 22. After that, So now you start to understand that these guys got depleted to the core. It's just not foot mobiles, but they lost, and this is something I pointed out to a lot of people from the get-go. The problem with Ukraine is that the officer corps is extremely limited. And those who can actually lead, and we're speaking from junior lieutenant to basically colonel, because beyond that, I mean, that's not actually leadership, it's just like brainstorming, and then you understand the logic behind it. The problem is that given the limited amount of people that could have to deal with the new guys in, every loss was counting double. And unfortunately, the homos that lost armor have stopped following those losses because it would give, in my opinion, a way worse image of the Ukrainian army than it should be. Back in the time, the compounded level of losses on the Ukrainian side, I had made a quick calculus. We were looking at about 80 to 90,000 people dead when more or less lost armor really stopped actually making a specific rubric for that. So that was it. The Ukrainians have also a problem, as I said, of attrition of their core personnel, so the NCOs and also the lower commissioned officers. They're getting cold because there is no other way to deal with it. Now, for a long while, the Ukrainians said, oh, we have to have a strong NCO corps that's going to help out, and then the planning officer will deal with something else, and another commanding officer will deal with something else, and it would pacify everything. Well, the more we are looking at this, the more we understand that for Ukraine, a lot of things that we spoke in the first series, the lack of money, the fact that they have bad friends for the thing they want to do, and also then the attrition, it's not only a strategic issue, it's also that for a lot of people, and I don't know if you remember, guys, but there was this brand new Ukrainian junior lieutenant that, or I think it was a captain. The guy had been leaving the academy, like 5 months before he was enlisted, they got fucking schwacked in Robotina. So the problem with Ukraine, as I said, on top of the strategic aspect, is also that they cannot see through any kind of quality, because in order to survive this war on their side, you need to be shit. If you are at the front lines, you're going to need MPK. If you are everything around 2 to 5 kilometers, you're going to get FPV. And we have these cases when you got this dude who's a colonel or lieutenant colonel who's supposed to be a missile defense body, figuring into an obituary. So then you start understanding why, for instance, despite the fact that for now 2.5 years, even 3 years, the Russians systematically going for the heights, hasn't been properly understood by the Ukrainians. The Russians systematically locking roads, basically creating a choke point situation that would force Ukrainians to bypass in one or another, is still not understood. And I know people are going to say, yeah, but look at what they did with the Dobropira salient. First thing they did, they deblockaded the road. It was a screen. The whole point was to attract the Ukrainians there so they wouldn't start pushing down the road and clearing up a path for guys to Minograd to either get resupplied or get the fuck out. So in fact, once we start analyzing properly, we see that the tactical problem on the Ukrainian side can be defined by the fact that Ukraine itself wasn't prepared for the war, despite every long bullshit that is being said by Americans and France and by the Ukrainians themselves. For Ukraine, it was a huge fluke, and their biggest chance was that Monkey was in charge initially. Monkey's still in charge, by the way. But on the military side, he, in my opinion, has started to shut the fuck up. And I think the politicians are starting to leave to a certain level within the Russian military the right to do what the fuck they want. And this changes everything. It changes everything because then you can understand that whatever Ukrainians are trying to do for the last 2 years is not some great scheme of things. It's just desperation because they're forced to react to what the Russians are doing. Kursk was a reaction to the situation deteriorating with the Kharkov buffer zone attack in May 2024. And within 3 months, the Ukrainians had done the same, but now in Kursk. And then, instead of keeping it small a bit, what the Russians are doing on pretty much every transfrontier incursion, there was nothing. And it is there that you understand there is a lack of quality of junior officers, there's lack of quality of the NCOs, and there's going to be a lack of quality because you wasted the first wave. The first guys who were more or less ideologicals, who were patriots for 404, got wasted in a certain sense to give the illusion that the war was winnable. The issue with this idea is, once again, it's a misrepresentation of the tactical depth within a strategic system and a purely standalone tactical vision. For instance, seeing the Russians in Kupiansk and seeing the Russians in Pokrovsk, seeing the Russians in Stogorsk and so forth and so on, you can see that the only thing literally making them cover are drones. When it comes to going to the firefight, even if they get killed, ambushed, whatever, they are going to it. These guys are not the guys who got bust. So the situation, once you start analyzing it differently, is that where you can call them stupid and a part of their HQ is stupid, the other guys are just not well trained enough. And even the Ukrainians themselves say that even those who are trained abroad have major issues making the hosts understand that, guys, you are behind everything. This is not how we do it in Ukraine. We had that initially in 2023 when people were complaining that, oh, the training they gave us was like kind of survivor stuff. It was not what we were expecting. We were expecting drones, stuff like that. Then more recently, we had just the same discussion with another person. So the reality of the tactical shortcomings of the Ukrainian side is that they didn't think, they still are not thinking about how and why the Russians every time seem to have their number. We can speak about mass assault and stuff like that, which is going to be bullshit. But the most important part is that, as I said the last time, Ukraine not having a victory plan or a way to deal with the situation means that what they're going to do, what's going to happen, is more of the same and hoping it's going to work. But even themselves know that it's never going to work. What they're trying to do here, I'm talking about Ukraine, is not as much to resist to the last one. The whole idea, as I said yesterday, is to resist enough so the Russians would get like wasted or they would collapse or whatever like that. So you don't have this resistance level when you are going to at some point start making the whole thing shake. Donc, if we have to check on the tactical shortcomings of the Ukrainian side and apply that to the map, one of the tactical shortcomings is, as I said, there is no B plan for troop reinforcements. There is nothing there to be able to quickly plug gaps. When Dobropila happened, Siski went to grab whatever he could, weakening other areas. And of course, people are going to say, oh, that's attrition. That's not per se attrition. You can have a shortage of people on the roundabout, but you also can see how tactically can stall until another force is going to come. But at the same time, you need to understand the situation. Dobropila wasn't understood as a screen. It was understood as a deep penetration to do one or the other thing, both of them being exclusive to one another. So either those guys were like Russian Superman, which, as I said, on a very narrow band, they're going to reach the other side of Kherson. And in a lot of ways, it felt like a projection from their own narrative when it comes to Ukrainians. So to wrap up this part of the space, the tactical issue with the Ukrainians, as I said, is the fact that they have lost their officer pool. Part of it also was not adequate. They are having, as I said, a shortage of ideologicals because those were the first to get the bullet fighting the Russians. There is also a huge problem with who allocates the goods. For instance, for the drones, they had this absolute stupid system, this gaming system, which allotted points for kills. Now, I mean, with the FPVs, you are hard pressed to say that only one side is gamifying the game, the game of killing. The fact that you install this system is also so that you can justify not giving enough. And this is what's happening. This is what the Ukrainians are saying. On one side, you have Rubicon, who has everything they want. On the other side, you have us, which is basically some artisanal workshop asking for donations. So once again, you start understanding, once you start piling up everything, in order to achieve the strategic element of surprise or to get crown, you need to figure out also what the fuck is going on. And Ukraine might be because of Russian pressure, might be also because of, as I said, a lack of decent human material to actually command and control. But there is nothing there. And it's not, right now, I'm not slighting the Ukrainian leadership, the military or political. I really think they got hit very hard by these 4 years of war, and they just simply cannot cope because it takes time for everything. And if you want an element of that, how are you going to have a proper fleet of F-16s with decent pilots if at maximum every pilot for a year now has flown maybe 60 hours with an extremely reduced pool? So normally they should get more airtime. And this is your main problem here. You got incapable people, you got lack of general vision, where are we going with this? And most importantly, there is denial. And this denial is everywhere, from Cope State to Sirski. And as I said, your problem, once you're Sirski and start to lie or deny things that everybody's seeing, then you're gone. You're not in the real world anymore. And the other problem that befalls upon Ukraine is that, as I said, they do not seem to understand what's going on the ground, despite the fact that they have a fuck ton of assets above the fucking ground. And this goes directly to belie the allegedly bad training and lack of quality of the Russian soldier. So to finish this whole debacle of a space over the tactical proficiency of the Ukrainian side, you just need to see, as I said, what happened the last 4 months. One of the biggest L's that the Ukrainians are paying right now is the loss of the Serebrenka forest, which happened very suddenly. because it was being defended by Ukrainians like lions, and then suddenly it was over. Once that area was cleared, then you have the pouring that you have right now. Siversk, Liman, Yampo. The complication of trying to take that as a hint to where to go next is that for the Ukrainians, that situation is unical. So it doesn't matter. You don't need to learn much from it. We're just going to reply to another situation. And in short, Ukraine is not controlling its destiny. It's getting hit by it. And the only thing is like surviving the strike. Now, the other situation that you have is that once you start analyzing, I said, the tactical approach from the Russians, I said, stacking the single roads, forcing Ukrainians to spend more on economically, but also materially, on resupplying and defending and stuff like that. This happens, and it's very complicated to say it like this. This happens not in a vacuum. This happens because the Ukrainians, up to end of 2023, were still high on their own victories of 2022. And who was high of those was Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny admitted he fucked up with the counter only because he was discharged by Zelensky. So once again, I want you to pull out the map and see how it's going. Just check how it's going in Ulyapolye. Just check how it's going also around Novodalinovka. The biggest issue the Ukrainians have is not just that they're exhausted or they're too few, is that whoever has taken over, they have only two levels. Making gore compilations, fuck Magyar, or getting butt fucked. Like Hand the Weave Brigade, 127, and stuff like that. So that's the main problem. You don't have the human material. You don't also understand after the multiple times something has happened to you. And then you start having this huge situation that's unfolding. And what happens then? You cannot change it and save it on the ground, but what you can do is just put it under a gray zone and it's fine. Yes, I'm aiming at deep cope, but deep cope is transmitting, in my opinion, point per point whatever they've been given by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Et c'est ça le truc drôle. This is your funny thing. There is nothing that compares on both sides. On one side, the Ukrainians are going to go lower and lower and lower to the point they're going to do a black pork one in the fucking front of a building full of guys who want to kill your ass for simply zero gain. There is no way that thing made sense to anyone unless there was a bigger op that was prevented by Russian drones or by Russian intervention. And people are going to applaud you. This is also the other problem I want to talk about. The issue is that the guys who are applauding the Ukrainian nimbleness, agility, and so forth and so on, they don't give a fuck about Ukrainians. For them, whatever is going on there is like some kind of village fun. You get these two dumbasses from a village and you're coming from the city and you see them fighting and you're just laughing at them. And yes, those two idiots are Ukraine and Russia. So on one side you have Ukrainians that who have nothing that can actually change to how they are strategically. Then you have this problem tactically. And then you start understanding your situation. And the situation is that, as I said on the last piece, you see that tactically you have no much chance. And then you link the dots and you see that strategically you're fucked. The only way you're not fucked is a huge, return on the previous position, which wasn't good as well. So once you see this way and you start seeing, okay, they do not have the human material, they do not have the equipment to go by it, they do not have the support by their allies, they do not have the critical aspect that goes with it. Their allies send them to go and fuck themselves in Krinky. I mean, come on, guys. Of course, they're gonna find it cute and fine that you drop 11 idiots with a Black Hawk in the dead center of a kill zone from the Russian side. The lack of accountability by the sponsors towards Ukraine has been absolutely godsend for the Russians. And it also shows that politically, there is no brain behind Ukraine. I'm saying politically, once again, there is no brain behind Ukraine. The moment you understand this, you also understand why Zelensky is going all apeshit the way he's doing. Nobody's proposing him an actual plan, not that he will take it as well. He doesn't give a fuck. But when he goes out and says, like today, oh, you know what, we will fight to the end, we're not going to compromise, whatever. And like everybody at Team or Criminal was like, whenever, bro, THD all the way. But there too you can see that Ukrainians have a huge tactical issue, even politically. They cannot find a way to convince the Europeans that, it's maybe better not to talk too much and let them do the deed instead of trying to control everything. And I completely understand that problem, I'm not going to lie about that. I understand that problem. But it's not how it should work. And once again, it doesn't work not because Ukrainians are completely stupid. It doesn't work because the situation that was imposed on the Ukrainians, once again, the zugzwang the Ukrainians are forced to do, allows the Russians to have more time than Ukrainians to figure out the situation. Because there where the Ukrainians try to take the advantage, the initiative, is on areas where the Russians led them. And even there, soon enough, the Russians are going to get back to them. So, then you understand why, a bunch of autists on Twitter start looking at the map saying this. And in a way or another, all that shit happens. You're going to tell me, yeah, okay, it's not difficult once you figure out how it works. Well, how the fuck is it possible that some randos on a fucking glorified forum that is Twitter now can see things that the Ukrainians cannot see? And I know that a lot of people are going to say, yeah, but it's not easy for them. They cannot just sacrifice the land, stuff like that. It is that easy. It is how it was the first 3-4 weeks of this war. They just pulled out, they dislocated in order then to start hitting Russian logistics. The problem is that there is nothing to dislocate anymore. They're dislocated to a point of non-return. That hole with 2, 3, 4 people, that's now the typical Ukrainian core defensive unit. Literally one hate drop away. Now, as for the rest, I think that the Russians know exactly what's the weakest point currently on the Ukrainian lineup. And it's not the location, it's not a focal point. The weakest point is the inability to treat more than one crisis at a time. And that's it. That's how things are for Ukraine right now. And they can blame their allies, they can blame themselves, they can also blame the Russians for not being completely utterly retarded. But the reality is pretty simple. Reality is that the tactical issues are just a symptom of the larger strategic problem. Only the strategic problem is easier to detect and see, whereas the other side of the equation is far more difficult to understand and start pointing a finger into them. And it's even more difficult when you see a problem for something. I mean, I'm going to go back to that January thread. When everybody was speaking about cores, for instance, I was like, this is not like you're going to shape them from a get-go and completely have a new course. What you're going to do is just agglomerate multiple brigades in one huge puddle and hope that the best brigades are going to pull out the worst brigades. Unfortunately, those best brigades suffered as much casualties as the others. The only thing is that for one reason or another, they kept fighting. So the example of Azov in Mariupol, those guys could have surrendered from the get-go, and in their minds, we stopped the Russians long enough for the other things to be taken. Well, obviously that's, first of all, wrong. But the most important part is that how to understand the Ukrainian tactical defensive mind and how to integrate it within a strategic lecture of the Ukrainian effort. And a lot of people have pointed out that politically, for instance, nobody can explain why the fuck Zelensky let the guys from 1822 go. And once you start having this logic of who does what, how does it work, and why Ukraine is in the situation it is, you can only understand what I said from the beginning, that whereas the Russians had a huge problem with the political steaming the military, with Ukraine it has completely changed. Now the military is obeying the politicals who are trying to choke them into tasks that are not correct. And I know, I'm going to say, I completely understand that they are defending, quote unquote, the land. So it's a lot more complicated for them to just give up and try to move on the back. But the reality is exactly that one. And I said that yesterday. where the Russians had the most difficulties is when they had to stretch as long as possible. Is when I had to do 160, 175 kilometers to reach was in a sense can just get smashed over there because there was half a BTG on the area against a rather large city. So there is not much like you can extract from Ukrainians right now tactically. That would make sense. And again, we go back to there is no plan. There is no plan because it would entail losses that would be worse than now when it's already bad. And so this pressure from the top, instead of freeing, some kind of, new mental power, whatever, for the Ukrainians, is more and more a way to convince them that they have lost, but it's not a official mood. It's an